The gunshot cracked through the lobby before anyone even saw the weapon. Elena Carter dropped to the floor on instinct, her palms slamming against cold tile as a child's scream tore through the hallway behind her. Glass rained down from a shattered window. Papers scattered from an overturned desk. For 3 frozen seconds, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at the 2 men in dark suits standing in the doorway of a learning center she had spent a decade building from nothing. Then the lights died. Every single one of them, all at once, plunging the building into total darkness. And in that darkness, a voice she hadn't heard in 12 years cut through the chaos like a blade. Get away from her. Elena's whole body went rigid. That voice, she would have known it anywhere, in a crowd of thousands, across decades, in her sleep. It was the voice that had once whispered promises against her hair in the quiet dark of their old apartment. It was the voice that had vanished into silence the night before their wedding and never spoken to her again. Until now, what followed happened too fast for her mind to fully process. The sound of fabric tearing, a body slamming into a wall hard enough to crack drywall, a second man grunting in pain, then silence, then the unmistakable metallic hiss of a blade being drawn and just as quickly sheathed again. She heard footsteps, controlled, deliberate, terrifyingly calm, moving through the darkness like he could see every inch of it. When the emergency lights flickered back to life, harsh and fluorescent, Elena finally saw him. Kaiden Mori stood over 2 unconscious men, his suit jacket torn at the shoulder, blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow, his chest rising and falling with the aftermath of violence he'd clearly executed without hesitation. 12 years had carved new lines into his face, new weight into his shoulders, but his eyes, the moment they found hers across the wreckage of the lobby, were exactly the eyes she remembered. Except now, they held something else. Something haunted. Kaiden, she breathed, and the name felt foreign and familiar all at once, like a word in a language she tried desperately to forget. He took a step toward her, and every instinct in Elena's body told her to run. But her legs wouldn't move. 12 years of grief, confusion, and unanswered questions rose in her throat all at once, and all she could manage was a single, trembling whisper. "You're supposed to be gone." "I never left," Kaiden said, his voice breaking. "I was never gone. Not once." To understand how 2 people ended up in that darkened lobby, blood on the floor, and 12 years of silence between them, you have to go back to where it all began. Long before the Empire, long before the violence, back to a small cafe in Canada where none of this was supposed to happen at all. Elena had been 24, fresh off a flight from Atlanta, with a teaching scholarship and a stubborn refusal to use English even when her Japanese failed her. She'd been standing at the counter, mangling her order so badly the barista had visibly given up trying to understand her, when a quiet, composed young man in an expensive suit had stepped in beside her and translated without being asked. "You're overcomplicating it," Kaiden had said, the corner of his mouth twitching into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Just say you want the same thing as everyone else." "It's simpler. I don't want the same thing as everyone else." Elena had shot back, more defensive than she intended. "I want what I want." He'd laughed, really laughed, an unguarded sound she would later learn was rare for him. And something in her chest had shifted instantly, irreversibly. They spent the next 2 years falling into each other slowly and completely. She taught him idioms that made him wince. He showed her a version of Tokyo tourists never found. Quiet shrines behind glass towers, ramen shops with no signage, a rooftop where you could see the whole city breathing beneath you. She moved in with him within the first year. He kept a ring hidden in his desk drawer for months before he found the courage to give it to her. Kneeling in that same rooftop spot, city lights blurring behind unshed tears in both their eyes. "Marry me," he'd said simply, "and I promise I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." She'd said yes before he even finished the sentence. Nobody warned her that the man who made that promise was already standing on the edge of a war he hadn't chosen and couldn't escape. The missed call started 8 months before the wedding. Late-night meetings that ran until dawn. A new tension in his jaw whenever his phone buzzed, a habit of scanning rooms the moment he entered them. Of course she noticed. She asked him once, gently, sitting across from him at dinner, if everything was okay. "It's just work," he'd said, that same practiced, unreadable smile sliding into place. "Nothing you need to worry about." She believed him because she wanted to, because the alternative, that the man she loved was hiding something dangerous enough to threaten everything they'd built, was unthinkable. What she didn't know, what she wouldn't learn for 12 more years, was that Kaiden's father had not died of a heart attack 18 months earlier, as the obituaries claimed. He had been assassinated by a rival faction inside his own criminal empire, an empire built on decades of blood and quiet violence, dressed up in the respectable clothing of legitimate business. And Kaiden, 26 years old and utterly unprepared, had inherited not just a company, but a war. The night before the wedding, his phone rang at 11:42 p.m. The caller ID showed nothing. He almost didn't answer. He would spend the rest of his life regretting that he did. "Kaiden," said a voice on the other end, calm, almost pleasant, which made what followed so much worse. It was Ringiando, his father's former lieutenant, a man Kaiden had begun to suspect, quietly and without proof, of orchestrating his father's death. "I hear congratulations are in order. A wedding tomorrow, no less." "Leave her out of this," Kaiden said, his knuckles white around the phone. Ando laughed softly. "That decision isn't mine to make anymore, Kaiden. It's yours. You can have the bride, or you can have the legacy your father died protecting. But you cannot have both. If she walks down that aisle with you tomorrow, she becomes a target in a war she doesn't even know exists. And I promise you, wars like ours don't discriminate. They don't care that she's innocent. They only care that she's yours." The line went dead. Kaiden sat alone in his office for nearly an hour after that, staring at the Tokyo skyline through Rain Street glass, his father's old katana resting on the desk beside him. The only inheritance he had left that didn't come soaked in someone else's blood. He thought about Elena asleep 3 floors below, unaware that her entire future had just been reduced to a single brutal choice. He thought about the wedding dress hanging in their closet, the seating chart she'd agonized over for weeks, the tentative plans they'd made to visit her family in the spring. He made his decision before the sun rose, and it was the hardest thing he had ever done. He didn't choose the empire because he wanted power. He chose it because walking away from it meant leaving Elena exposed to men who wouldn't hesitate to use her as leverage, as bait, as a message written in violence. So instead, he chose to disappear. He chose to become a man she would despise so completely that she would never look back, never search for him, never give the enemies circling his life a single thread to pull. He left without a word. He let her call his number until it disconnected. He let her stand in an empty hallway, calling his name into silence. He let her believe the absolute worst about him, because hatred, however painful, was safer for her than love. Love, in his world, came with a body count. For the first year afterward, Elena barely left her apartment except to teach. She lost weight she didn't have to spare. Her mother flew in from Atlanta and stayed 3 weeks, quietly cooking meals that went cold, untouched on the counter. Elena kept asking the same unanswerable question over and over. What did I do wrong? No answer ever came, because the only man who could have given her one had already vanished into a life engineered, so she would never find him. What Elena never knew, not for over a decade, was that Kaiden hadn't truly disappeared from her life. He had only disappeared from her sight. Every scholarship that mysteriously appeared during her graduate studies, he funded through an anonymous foundation with a name meaningless to anyone but him. Every safe apartment she moved into, quietly vetted by people who never knew who they truly worked for. When a landlord once tried to illegally evict her, an unnamed legal team appeared out of nowhere and crushed the case within a week. When she finally saved enough to open a modest learning center for underprivileged children in eastern Tokyo, an anonymous donor covered the difference between her savings and the building's actual cost. He watched her rebuild an entire life out of the wreckage he had created, and every step of it cost him more than she would ever know. He watched her fall in love once, briefly, with a man named Daisuke, forcing himself not to interfere even as something violent and possessive clawed at his ribs. When a relationship quietly ended a year and a half later, Kaiden felt a shame he could never fully justify. Relief, sharp and immediate, at the fact that she was still, somehow, waiting for something she couldn't name. By day, he built a reputation as the coldest, most ruthless CEO in Tokyo's corporate world, a reputation he cultivated deliberately because fear kept dangerous curiosity away from what he really did after the office lights went dark. By night, he became someone else entirely, meeting contacts in dim izakayas that smelled of grilled fish and cigarette smoke, negotiating in rooms where the wrong word could get a man killed before the sentence finished. Piece by piece, brick by blood-soaked brick, he dismantled the empire that had once threatened to consume her. It should have gotten easier with time. It never did. Every year, on the anniversary of the night he left her, Kaiden sat alone in his penthouse with a glass of whiskey he never finished, staring at photographs locked in a drawer no assistant was ever permitted to touch. He never let himself call her. He never let himself walk past her school, even when his driver's route ran within a few blocks of it. Distance, he told himself over and over, was the only gift he had left to give her. Do you think you could endure that? 12 years of watching someone you love build an entire life without you in it. Every milestone reported secondhand by people paid to protect her, and never once being allowed to say, "I'm still here. I never stopped loving you." It takes an almost inhuman kind of restraint to love someone that completely and remain invisible. But empires, even ones being carefully dismantled, have a habit of biting back exactly when you think you finally won. 12 years to the month after that rainy night, Ando's remaining allies grew desperate. Kaiden had spent over a decade quietly severing nearly every resource they had left. Cornered men do reckless things, and reckless men go looking for weaknesses. They couldn't find Kaiden's private life. He had been ruthless about that, meticulous for years. But somewhere, someone made a mistake. An old wire transfer that hadn't been scrubbed cleanly enough. A single financial thread connecting an anonymous foundation to a modest, growing learning center in eastern Tokyo. They found Elena. Kaiden's phone buzzed at 2:47 p.m. on an ordinary Tuesday. A single alert from the security contact he'd paid, quietly, for over a decade to watch the block where Elena's center stood. Two unfamiliar men. A sedan registered to a shell company he recognized instantly. One of Ando's last remaining fronts. The air in his office dropped 10 degrees. For 12 years, he had followed exactly one rule. Keep your distance, no matter what, and never let her know you're watching. He hadn't broken it once, even when it nearly destroyed him to hold to it. He broke it that afternoon without a single moment of hesitation. He was already moving before the second buzz of his phone finished. His driver barely had the car door open before Kaiden was inside, snapping out an address that made the older man's hands tighten on the wheel. They tore through Tokyo traffic with a recklessness Kaiden hadn't allowed himself in over a decade. Running lights, cutting lanes, his jaw locked, so tight it ached, his mind replaying every worst-case scenario he'd spent 12 years trying not to imagine. Which brings the story back to that lobby, that darkness, that gunshot, and the reunion neither of them had ever let themselves believe would come. Standing in the wreckage, blood on his knuckles, Kaiden watched 12 years of carefully constructed distance collapse in the space of a single breath. Elena stared back at him, her whole body trembling, not from the cold, but from the impossible collision of relief, rage, and grief crashing through her all at once. "You," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You the donor, the scholarship, the apartment, this building. It was you. It was you this whole time." Kaiden didn't deny it. He didn't try to soften what was coming. "I never left you," he said quietly. "Not really. I just made sure you never saw me." "Why?" she demanded, her voice cracking as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. 12 years of buried questions finally forcing their way to the surface. "Do you have any idea what you put me through? I thought I wasn't enough. I thought I did something wrong. I built an entire life believing you abandoned me on purpose." "I know," he said, guilt raw and unguarded in his voice, more honest than he'd allowed himself to be in over a decade. "I know, and I am so sorry. But if I had stayed that night, you wouldn't have lived to see today. They would have used you against me. They would have killed you to send me a message, and I couldn't survive that. I would rather you hate me alive than love me and end up in the ground." The confrontation that followed was explosive, years of unspent grief and fury finally colliding in a single room. She hit his chest with both fists, sobbing, demanding to know why he had never trusted her enough to let her choose the danger alongside him. She told him about the sleepless nights, the years of therapy, the wedding dress she still hadn't been able to throw away no matter how many times she tried. She told him he had stolen more than his presence. He had stolen her ability to trust anyone completely, ever again. Kaiden took every word without flinching, because he knew he deserved every ounce of her anger. He simply stood there and let her finally break the silence that had defined both their lives, understanding that after 12 years, she had more than earned the right to say all of it. When her voice finally gave out, when the anger burned down into something rawer and quieter, she asked the question that had haunted her more than any other. "Was it worth it? Everything you gave up, was any of it worth it?" Kaiden was quiet for a long moment, looking at the woman he had loved enough to disappear for, the woman he had rebuilt himself into a weapon just to keep safe from a distance. "Every single day I didn't get to see your face," he said finally, "was worth it because it meant you got to keep yours." It took weeks, not moments, for Elena to even consider forgiveness. Trust, once shattered that completely, doesn't rebuild itself overnight, no matter how sincere the apology or how dramatic the reunion. There were more arguments in the months that followed. There were nights she told him to leave and meant it. There were mornings she caught herself dialing his number before she could stop, hanging up before it rang, hating herself for the pull she still felt toward a man who had made an impossible decision without ever asking if she wanted to share the risk. But slowly something shifted. Kaiden dismantled what remained of the Mori Empire piece by piece, not to protect himself this time, but to finally close the door on the world that had cost them 12 years. He cooperated quietly with authorities dismantling Ando's remaining network in exchange for the information only he possessed. He walked away from boardrooms, from wealth built on blood, from a legacy he had never wanted to inherit in the first place. They didn't return to the life they'd once planned because that life no longer existed. Too much time had passed. Too much had changed in both of them. Instead, they built something new together, slower and more deliberate this time. Kaiden started showing up at Elena's learning center not as a silent, anonymous name on a foundation letter, but as a visible, present partner, helping paint classroom walls, sitting through budget meetings, learning the names of children who had no idea the quiet man beside their teacher had once been one of the most feared figures in Tokyo's underworld. It took nearly a year before Elena let herself believe any of it was real. It took another before she agreed to wear his ring again. Not the original one from 12 years earlier, but a new one, simpler, chosen together this time instead of decided upon in secret. On a quiet morning, nearly 2 years after that terrifying afternoon in the lobby, they stood together on a balcony overlooking a Tokyo skyline that no longer felt threatening. The harsh neon of the city's underworld replaced by the soft gold light of an ordinary sunrise. Elena looked down at her hand, at the ring catching the early light, and for the first time in over a decade, she felt something close to peace settle into her chest. Their story was never going to be simple. It wasn't a fairy tale free of pain, free of the years lost or the trust that had to be painstakingly rebuilt from almost nothing. It was messier than that, harder than that. A story of two people who had each been willing to become the villain in the other's eyes if it meant the other person got to survive. It was proof that sometimes love doesn't look like staying. Sometimes, in the darkest circumstances, it looks like walking away so someone else gets to keep living. If this story moved you even a fraction of how deeply it moved the two people who lived it, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story like this one. Drop a comment below and let us know honestly. Do you think what Kaiden did was the ultimate sacrifice, or was it the ultimate betrayal dressed up as love? And if you haven't already, give this video a like